Hey guys, what's happening? Robert Coons here. So this video is about why we choose to practice internal martial arts like Tai Chi, Xingyi, or Bagua. I think this is a pretty relevant question. I've been practicing the internal arts for well over 20 years. Not as long as some people, but longer than some people. And I've met a bunch of pretty well-known teachers in both North America and China. Um, Myself, I can't say that I'm a master or anything, but I'm good enough to teach some basic stuff to people, and I enjoy my practice and have found it very fulfilling over the years. So I thought I would give a little talk about why it is that I choose to practice these arts and why they might be the right arts for you too. Um, a lot of the time in the Chinese martial arts world, or especially the internal martial arts world, there are these discussions that go on about, whether or not this is good for fighting, or whether it's good for self-defense, or whether it's health only. And a lot of the time, the construction, the conversations are not very constructive. You get some people who are very skeptical of the Chinese martial arts, saying, "Well, if you can't go up against Brock Lesnar or whoever the popular MMA leader is, then and you can't do it in the ring, then it doesn't qualify as fighting, or various other types of things in order to somehow denigrate the practices, or what have you." And I think these discussions are not very constructive because people do martial arts for a lot of reasons, not only to fight in a competitive setting. So I want to give a few of my personal thoughts about this, because I think that traditional martial arts shouldn't be understood as necessarily China versus Japan versus Korea, but instead we should sort of understand traditional East Asian martial arts as all having many, many similar characteristics. And then to be able to, rather than comparing ourselves in a positive or negative way to each other, or a positive or negative way to sport arts, instead to understand what the characteristic of traditional martial arts is, and the various reasons why people study them. So I'm going to use Xingyi as an example. Xingyi is relatively old Chinese internal style martial art. It has origins in the Muslim art of Xini Liu He Chuan, but since then it developed into its own style. Its golden age was in the early 20th century, and arguably it's going through a bit of a renaissance right now as well. The art is mostly a hard style, so mostly it's based on punching and kicking, with grabbing and joint locking and things like that as well. Um, in terms of the internal style martial arts, it's the one which is the most similar to Okinawan karate. If you're from an Okinawan or Japanese martial arts background, you would recognize a lot of the strategies in Xingyi as having some similarity with karate. The body method is very, very different though, but I'm just looking for something to compare it to. And so when we think about Xingyi, one of the things about it is, unlike Taiji, where we can always walk back our reason for practicing from combat to health, we can't do that as much with Xingyi, right? So in Taiji practice, it's very easy to say, well, I just practice for health and I don't really have any interest in martial application, or, self defense or any of these things. With Xingyi, that's not as possible because it's a very striking dominant martial art, and its health benefits are excellent if you practice well, but at the same time that's not the main reason why most people begin the practice. So I think in a position where we can't back up and move the goalpost and change our attitude about why we practice depending on who we're talking to, then we can start to have a more honest conversation about why we practice. um, I think that it's really useful to evaluate internal martial art practice from the perspective that you would evaluate something like karate or taekwondo. And what I mean by that is that karate as an art. So when I was a kid, I practiced Goju-ryu karate. It's a very nice style from Okinawa. Wonderful tradition, lots of great people in the tradition, and lots of really skilled people in the tradition. Um, when you practice karate, you can go into a sport-oriented karate where you're doing things like physical combat competition, right? So there's things like kyokushin karate, which are basically striking and kicking and throwing, in a combat rules based situation, similar to kickboxing, or perhaps identical to kickboxing in certain regards, depending on what style of kickboxing you're talking about. At the same time, you could go into competitive karate where you're doing things like kata competition, right, form competition, or you could go into non-competitive, more traditional approach to karate where you do self-defense drills and you do forms in order to refine your skill, and you do basic practice to refine your skill. And all of those are equally legitimate ways of training that all have many institutions surrounding them and are well developed and well accepted. And so um, every once in a while, you do see someone from a karate school coming up into competitive sport fighting at a larger level. There was somebody named, I think, Machiacha or Machiata a number of years ago from Brazil, who was doing karate, at a MMA level in the UFC. I don't know if anybody's still doing it because I don't. That's not my main interest in is not competitive fighting, but it certainly is possible. And in an art like Xingyi, it would be hypothetically possible. And certainly in China, there are Sanda fighters, which is Chinese style of kickboxing, who have traditional martial arts backgrounds. Also, and Sanda is actually highly based on Tanglang, praying mantis boxing. So certainly things like that are possible, but the majority of karate practitioners, the majority of Xingyi practitioners, the majority of Taiji practitioners, etc., they don't practice in order to do this kind of level of competition fighting. And so then we can ask ourselves, well, then what are they doing, right? And so I would say, arguably, that what people do in terms of these arts, the majority of people practice for health reasons, right? They want to stay healthy while doing an exercise that they find interesting in, that they can make progress in, that changes their interaction with their body, makes them feel more relaxed and stronger, and so on. That has a relatively low risk of injury, right? It's one of the big things about the internal martial arts is that compared to a lot of other forms of exercise, there's a relatively low risk of injury, and there's a relatively high degree of mind-body connection, which makes it so that people learn to move better and they're able to maintain their health in movement into old age. So I would say that those are especially attractive features of internal martial arts practice, including Xingyi. But then at the same time, a lot of people want to learn self-defense to some extent, right? So what do you need to be able to defend yourself against an untrained person? Now, this is a big conversation that happens in the martial arts world, especially in the traditional martial arts world, and people have opinions that range from black to white, heaven to earth, right? Everybody has an opinion about this. But I want to mention that self-defense doesn't exclusively mean that a highly motivated person is chasing after you with a knife, or that a highly trained person is chasing after you and trying to, beat you down, right? Actually, there are many, many situations where you might have to use a self-defense technique that doesn't involve things like striking or even, pushing an opponent or anything like that. There are many scenarios in which a person may be aggressive to you that you could use physical or mental skills that you develop in the martial arts in a context which stops the aggression without you having to get into a fight. And I think that this is, unless you're going out into places where you're likely to get into fights, this is probably the majority of self-defense situations that you're likely to be in are relatively minor, and they come from misunderstandings or they come from people being stupid and aggressive, and often they can be diffused by using physical skills that you develop in martial arts that don't require you to actually fight. So as an example, you're walking down the street and somebody intentionally tries to bump into you with their shoulder. Well, if you do Taiji and you have push hand skills, then you know how to evade that so that they can't get into your center, and therefore you just keep walking, and whatever happens to them, right? Whether they stumble or whether they keep going, it doesn't really matter, right? And you would notice that that was from your Taiji training. This happened to me all the time when I was living in Shanghai, because it's just such a crowded city that inevitably people are going to bump into each other. And I found that martial arts training from Taiji practice really helped a lot. For Xingyi, it's a little bit different, but you also learn to receive force. Sometimes you send it back, but it's basically the same kind of idea. At the same time, if somebody is aggressive to you in a situation outside, an art like Xingyi can make it so that you're less afraid of them, right? So you're able to stand up for yourself and not back down in the same way that you might if a person just aggressed you and you had no training at all. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that it's entirely possible that you could run into somebody who's highly motivated and has no ethics whatsoever and is very violent. And if you have traditional martial arts training, it might not be enough to defend yourself against them, right? So you should leave that open as a possibility. And if that's something that you're concerned about, then you might have to train in a way which is much, much more physically demanding and requires you to put a larger amount of personal risk on the table in order to get the skills that you want. So at that point, there's an argument to be made for learning high level kickboxing or learning things like Krav Maga, which are, much, much more oriented toward a much stronger and more violent environment. But depending on where you live, depending on what kind of behavior you personally engage in, often you can minimize the risk of that. And so minimizing risk doesn't mean no risk, but it does mean that you're less likely to encounter such situations. One of the things that's especially useful about getting older is that these situations happen to you less. So, well, those are certainly fair criticisms that you could make, like the internal martial arts approach to self-defense may not be sufficient to, give you 90 to 100% verification that you could defend yourself against a total maniac. At the same time, for many, many normal self-defense situations that you could get in, they're certainly perfectly sufficient. And I mean, even just things like knowing how to throw a punch or knowing how to block a punch or knowing how to, eat somebody's space or enter into their center, right? All of those different things you can learn through internal martial arts training. Xingyi Chuan is a great style for that. Bagua and Taiji are a little bit more evasive, but at the same time, you can learn all those skills there too. And maybe you do some combination of them. So for self-defense, I would say that probably internal martial arts training, especially Xingyi and Bagua, I would put them at sort of a similar effectiveness to traditional karate, right? Like, it's they're maybe not the most effective arts in the world for this, but at the same time, they're certainly sufficient for the majority of situations that you're likely to encounter. So Taiji, it's a little different because Taiji is totally self-defense, like it's totally defensively based. It's not aggressively based, whereas Xingyi is more aggressive. So for Taiji, I would say that for minor self-defense situations, it's probably actually better than Xingyi and Bagua. But for things where you have to be on the offensive, the skills that you learn in Taiji may be insufficient unless you are really lucky to encounter a teacher who has a really deep understanding of all of the combat tactics of Taiji. So that's the self-defense question, right? Can you do it? Yeah, I think so, for real. And it's going to be sufficient for the majority of situations that you'll find yourself in. If you're like a bouncer at a bar or something like that, then obviously you're going to have to up your level. So if you work in a field where self-defense or where combat is necessary, then if you're practicing traditional arts of any kind, then you're going to have to figure out how to make your level good enough. And that might involve cross-training, for instance, in arts that are not traditional arts, right? So in that kind of situation, you should think like a professional because you are a professional in that field. And so a professional wouldn't think, well, I absolutely have to express the principles of Xingyi every time I go to work at the bar. That's just asking for trouble, right? But generally speaking, okay, sufficient. How about competition? So for fighting competition, can the internal martial arts be used in fighting competitions? I think that the answer is yes, but with a big caveat. So let's talk about Taiji here. Taiji is one of the internal martial arts that has one of the most well-established forms of competition. So Taiji competition for, actual physical combat is called Tuishou. It means push hands, right? And this is a method of practice basically where two people are in touching range and they have their hands on each other's arms or their hands on each other's bodies. And they attempt to express Taiji principles within that pushing context. And there's so fixed step Tuishou and moving step Tuishou. For fixed step, you're both standing in one posture and you're pushing back and forth. And basically, one person tries to unbalance the other, and the person to be unbalanced loses that point, and the person who remains balanced gains a point, right? So that's how fixed step works. Moving step often involves things like throwing or pushing somebody out of the edge of the ring. And so in a certain sense, it's somewhat similar to judo or sambo or one of these other styles. of sort of a wrestling or throwing approach. But in another way, it's unique to Taiji because it has its own rule set, which is based on the ideas of Taiji. So, as an example, you don't. I don't think that you see catch as catch can wrestlers going to judo competitions and using exclusively catch techniques in gi fighting, right? So why would you expect people in the taiji world to behave any differently, right? So if you want to do taiji for sportive competition for combat, then you do it within the context of push ends and you follow the competitive taiji rules. So it's very unfair to make comparison against a sport like judo, who excel in throwing. Okay, right? Judo guys are fantastic throwers, maybe the best, but it's very unfair to make a competition against judo people if they were to go to a taiji competition and clean up, because they follow a completely different rule set with totally different fundamental understandings of how the art is supposed to work. So if you're talking about sport competition, you don't want to confuse sport competition and combat outside of sport, right? So the combat that a civil person might engage in self-defense, the combat that a person who practices sport engages in, and the combat that a military or police officer engages in are totally different matters. And they have some relationship, but they're not directly related, right? So in that case, yeah, definitely the internal martial arts can be used for sportive competition. However, if you were going to say, can I use Taiji or Xingyi or Bagua in MMA or in like K1 or something like that, the answer is you would probably need to cross train in styles that are more effective for that, and you might choose to bring some of your internal arts techniques in as a special way to do something unusual or unexpected. And so one of the things that was really interesting to see as MMA developed is that people started doing things like, spinning back fists. This is very surprising because you wouldn't think that it would work, but there's so much surprise factor there that you could do like a taekwondo technique once in a while, or you could make it a signature thing if you're really good at it, like a flying kick or something. And it might be effective if you were really, really good at it. But I'll tell you one thing for sure. Those are not just taekwondo black belts that go into those competitions. They have a lot of cross training and they're very serious about how they practice. So if you wanted to be an athlete in that kind of context and you would do internal styles, then you have to practice like an athlete, right? And you have to practice in the way that would make you successful in that kind of fighting context. And if you don't do it, then you really shouldn't go into those contexts. Okay, so there was this whole thing a couple years ago where some people in China who presented themselves as Taiji masters, most of whom were not very well known, but let's just take it for what it's worth, were beaten by like boxers and MMA people. But the issue is that those people had no competitive fighting experience whatsoever. So it's ridiculous that they even tried to do it in the first place. So for a person like me, hey, look, I'm 42 years old. I have some injuries. I'm a little overweight. I don't think that it's appropriate for me to try to go into competition sport. But at the same time, I really enjoy martial arts and I really enjoy practicing, playfully in a friendly competitive setting with my friends. I think that that's fine to do, but I would never pretend to be able to go to a higher level than that. And I think the majority of people who practice traditional martial arts, whether it's karate or tai chi or xingyi, they all have pretty similar understandings of that, unless they do decide to go to a higher level route, right? And so I think that the sport competition area, it's important to try to understand specifically what you're doing. If you're doing push hands competitions, I've seen people in their 50s clean up in push hands competitions because they have a lot of experience and they train really hard and they're really good at it. But, at the same time, if you put those people into a kickboxing environment, they'd lose very quickly, right? So this is an important point to differentiate. Like, judo people are doing judo competitions and some of them train for mixed martial arts, but you wouldn't go in as only a judo person. You'd learn some boxing, you'd learn some kickboxing, and then you'd go in, right? So for what we do in Taiji people do Taiji competitions. And if you wanted to train in a different format, you'd have to train in that way. Otherwise, you would get demolished. So it's not, can these arts be used for competition or not? Yeah, they have really well-established competitions. It's whether or not you would have the tools that you would need to go to other areas of competition outside of your art, and that's on you, right? So I think that's the most realistic way to see that and to put it. Now, in terms of like aesthetic competition, look, Taiji, Xingyi, Bagua, all of them have aesthetic competitions, and there's different types, right? So there's sport style Taiji competitions where these people are doing these beautiful kicks over their heads and doing the splits and stuff like that, and then there's traditional Taiji competitions where they're doing traditional forms, and these are organized at different levels, and you can do it. It's basically the same as competing in karate kata, right? So when I was part of the Canadian Goju Ryu Association. I can't remember the exact name of it right now, but I used to go do the occasional competition where I would compete in kata and sparring, and it was point sparring, not very hard stuff. And the kata was, showing traditional forms, but there are also sport styles of karate where they're showing much fancier routines, and there's also sport styles like Kyokushin where they're doing much harder full contact sparring. So having an idea of what the different kinds of competitions that you might go into would also be a major deciding factor about how you practice the internal arts for competition, right? So that part I think is also really easy to understand. So we've covered self-defense, right? So yeah, it's sufficient for many different areas of self-defense and self-protection that you would need. Obviously, you want to go to a high level, you might have to train in other methods, or you'd have to train much harder and much smarter. For sports, right? It's entirely contextual based on the style of sport and rule set in the art that you practice. And in terms of going to sportive events outside of the art, then obviously that's going to require a different type of training. Now, then the next reason why people train is for health and well-being. So can you attain health and well-being from doing the internal martial arts? They have different qualities, each art. So if you're doing an art like Xingyi or Bagua or Chen style Taiji in a sort of medium or low posture, then you can get cardio, you can get strength training, and it's sufficient really to practice part of your overall fitness. As you get older, you may need to do things like lift weights, and in general, you may need to do things like add more cardiovascular activity in specific ranges, such as really sudden explosive movement like sprinting. But beyond that, those practices are really, really good for a generalized approach to a certain level of strength training and a certain level of cardio training that's endurance based. So I think that that's really good physically, right? It can help you a lot. It can do things like keep your blood pressure down, help you manage your weight to some extent. That, of course, that's reliant on diet, right? Help you to feel much healthier, and also they're very relaxing physically. So Taiji, Xingyi, Bagua, all of them have different ways of making the muscles feel simultaneously toned and relaxed. That's really great. On the other hand, if you're doing certain styles of Taiji like the 24 or the 42, right, these kind of more health-based Taiji, they call health-based Taiji, it means that it doesn't have very much martial component to it, then you're not getting as much cardio. You're getting a little bit of stamina training, or a lot, depending how you do it. But the main benefit of those things is that they're very good for physical balance. They're very good for relaxation. They're very good for improving circulation, blood flow, attention. And so these are good for people who are aging, who maybe they want to do Taiji because they want to avoid having falls, or they have chronic pain that they want to make feel better, or they want to keep their blood pressure low. There's a myriad of different reasons why you would do them, but those would be the reasons to pick those particular styles of Taiji, rather than picking a more demanding one like Chen style, for instance. So again, with well-being and health practice, you would pick the art and relative to what you're trying to do. A 25-year-old who has great cardio, who wants to like get more flexible and more strong, probably isn't going to benefit as much from really, really soft, gentle, 24 style Taiji, that's mainly made for stretching, standing on one leg, getting better balance, and improving your circulation, right? So, but then at the same time, an older person who has creaky joints and has some health problems maybe wouldn't benefit so much from those lower postures and stronger use of force that the younger person does. So I think in that sense, the internal martial arts have a lot to offer, maybe more than almost any other style of martial art, because there's something there for everybody. Even if you're a high level athlete, like you're doing weightlifting, or you're doing running, or even combat sports, you could learn something like Taiji, and it could help you a lot in the recovery process. It could help you a lot to have better balance. And you could take a lot of things, a lot of inspiration from Taiji into your current sport that you do, and it would help you become a better athlete. So there really is something for everybody. I think that's probably the biggest selling point for me of the internal martial arts, is that you can take them over a long period of time and you can get benefit from them for your whole life. And that's great. I don't want to, make a negative comparison against any other style of martial arts. I like martial artists all to be a big family and not to, have too many needless arguments. But at the same time, I do think that the strong point of the internal martial arts is that ability to adopt them to your life situation throughout your entire life. It's really beautiful. It means that you can have exercise at different levels that you need from when you're really young to when you're really old, and it's just the nicest thing. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. So I think that those are broadly the reasons why people practice the internal martial arts, and certainly within those reasons are also the reasons why I practice. I think that for most of us, it would be extremely unrealistic to maintain a fantasy that we're going to have some sort of magical powers through the practice of these arts, almost no matter how hard we train. And I think it's better to be a little bit humble and to make positive comparisons with other traditional arts like karate or taekwondo or what have you, in order to appreciate our own arts from a realistic perspective, right? What is it that karate people expect to get out of their arts? A lot of them also train till they're old, and a lot of them are in very good physical shape, and they can do self defense in certain kind of competition. And I think that broadly, what we could expect to get out of our arts ought to be sort of in sync with that, rather than being what I think often happens, especially for younger people, which is that they hear these wonderful stories about the past generations of Chinese masters, and they want to emulate them, and somehow get really special abilities while barely putting in any effort. That's not a very realistic position, and it leads, I think, to a lot of letdown and unhappiness in the end. So ultimately, if you're practicing a traditional martial art, you should try to do it for the right reasons, and fit broadly within one or more of those contexts that I mentioned. So there's a health context, there's a sports context, and there's a self-defense context. Many people do all three. Some people pick two, and some people pick one. And any way you apply that is perfectly legitimate, because you do the art for yourself. You don't do it for some sort of weird abstract principle. Your practice of the art should be to provide you with happiness, and to provide you with those skills that you need, or that you believe you need, that you can obtain through those arts. And then all you have to do is practice appropriately to get those skills, be open-minded, and if you need to get skills from other places, you can bring them from other places. But ultimately, you should direct yourself to practice in a way that's practical and gets you the thing that you want. And if it's not provided by the internal martial arts, then maybe they're not for you. But man, I mean, being in better health, having some basic self-defense skills, and maybe doing a little bit of competitive sports stuff sounds really great to me. So I've been happy practicing these arts for the past 20 or so years. And I hope that you also get a lot of value from your practice. I wanted to mention this just because recently I've been a little bit more active in martial arts, especially Xingyi. I've been teaching a little bit, just basic stuff. And it's made me think a lot about why I practice and what I would like to transmit in practice. So I thought I'd make this little impromptu YouTube video. You can tell me what you think, and tell me what kind of content you'd like to see about Qigong and the internal martial arts and Taoist meditation, and I'll be happy to oblige. Okay, see you next time.